Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Celeste Hamre. I'm a double major in psychology and sociology, and I also have a minor in public health. And my project today is titled, Is It Easy as ABC? How American Families Navigate the Special Education System. Just a quick overview of my presentation today. I'm going to go through my project development, my methodology, my recruitment strategies, results, and my next stages in this project as well. So this is a picture of me and my twin sister. You can tell who's me and the cuter one on the far side. But this project is actually not inspired by my coursework, but instead inspired by my personal narrative. So I grew up dyslexic. I had a lot of resources. I entered college, and I assumed that having dyslexia or another language-based learning disorder wouldn't really matter in college. Like most people like me, it was something that maybe was good for your resume or talking about challenges, but not necessarily something that could really define your college experience. However, I came to find out through the course of my college career that this was not the case. Over $10,000 was spent by my family alone for private tutoring, testing, and other resources, a huge time investment. My parents talked to their other friends, other professionals to help me get the best possible resources and tutors. It was a stress for my family, and the bottom line, it was a source of privilege. Going to college and not having to think about being dyslexic anymore is an example of privilege. And so I wanted to investigate my personal narrative and see how it applied on a larger scale, and hopefully make suggestions or some conclusions on how nuanced this process is and how challenging it can be for families. I think a lot of times when we talk about learning disorders in education, we talk on an individual level of people overcoming challenges, but in reality, there's multiple sociological factors and societal structures that make some people like me have a really easy time and come to college and have it not really be a big factor, and for others to be detrimental to their education experience. So about 15% of children in the United States have some form of identifiable learning disability, but only 5% of children actually have a diagnosis. And this is what informed my research question. What happens to this 5% that they get a diagnosis and resources, and another 10% who are left behind? In particular, I wanted to know, how do parents actually navigate the special education system? How do they secure that diagnosis and actually access resources after the diagnosis? So as you can imagine, the project development for this was a pretty intense process. I actually started last May in 2015. I did a pretty intense literature review. After I drafted my first round of interview questions, I talked to educators, current researchers on the topic, administrators in education. After finalizing my questions, I went through them again. I did practice interviews, and then from IR approval, I recruited. I had the actual interviews, transcription, and then on to the coding and analysis phase. I think that dealing with this really niche and kind of vulnerable population, it was really important to me that I spend some time on project development and make sure I was asking informed questions. Just a quick background on special education in the United States. Basically, it depends really on your school district what services are available to you, but there are basically three distinct stages that everyone navigating the system will experience. That's obtaining a diagnosis, development of an individual education plan or a 504 plan. That's basically what resources pertain to your diagnosis you have the right to have access to, and then the implementation of those written accommodations as well. Originally, I wanted to interview both parents and teachers, but I ended up ultimately really focusing on parent populations. So I wanted to have a sociological framework to my project, and this is inspired by French sociologist Pierre Bourdieu. He was really into French culture, and he studied how the different forms of capital, like social capital, cultural capital, economic capital, can all inform our experiences and help maintain our social structure in society. So here's a little bit of background. So social capital might be your friends and your resources. Your cultural capital could be, are you familiar with fine wines, or maybe you're more familiar with a cheaper set of beer. And monetary or economic capital is simply the use of financial resources. So I was interested in each stage of this special education navigation, how families use these different forms of capital. They talk to professionals, they have family friends who they could kind of ask, do you experience the same thing? What should I say? Do they have money they could use for private tutoring and private testing? Or do they have cultural capital? Were they educated? Do they have an education or a master's in education? So I was really interested in each of these distinct stages, how these forms of capital were utilized. So recruitment at first was really challenging. I wanted to talk to parents who had a child 18 years or older who had successfully navigated this system, so had gone through each of the stages. As you can imagine, how do you identify people who've been through this? I first thought Facebook was going to be my way in. I made a Facebook page. I liked lots of different advocacy groups' Facebook pages. It really kind of hit. I gathered maybe 3 or 4 this way, and I had to install a variety of other strategies. I developed my first ever Twitter account for this project. It was Learning Disorder Study, and I tweeted at different groups. I tweeted at people. I actually also developed a website, the Hamre Interview Project. It has like my IRB approved blurb about the project, and I would link it to everything. This website ended up being viewed over 1,000 different times and was reposted on multiple pages, including Columbia University's Learning Disorder Study Center. So I was able, through these kind of variety of different ways, to recruit a larger population than I initially thought. Also, a lot of people that I actually interviewed referred me to friends or other people who had the same experiences, and that was a great way. I think these are really promising results for an undergraduate to accomplish this many interviews, but it took a lot of work. Only a third of each initial contact of someone who was interested in my project led to an actual interview. You can see like the statistics here. The big question for me is the retweet snowball sampling. I don't know, maybe we'll see that later. And I was able to talk to people from 8 different states as well. Some strong limitations of my project. The project development was pretty time consuming. Again, accessing such a niche population, people who want to talk about it. It's a sensitive topic. It's about your kids. It's about the challenges your kids might have faced as well. Again, transcription, getting 38 interviews as an undergraduate. They were an hour to 2 hours long. It was pretty much impossible for me to transcribe them myself. I'd adjust my project timeline, but we're working on it. So the next stage is interview transcription. But I conducted all the interviews myself and did transcribe some of them, and I've also listened to them all to highlight my 9 broad coding themes. Some interesting notes so far: 93% of my interviewees were female, and the most successful advocates were actually all females who had a higher education degree, a graduate degree in education itself. So that's really a great example of how nuanced and difficult the system is, that those who could access the best resources actually had a degree in how to go about and navigate the system. These are my 9 major coding themes. I'm not going to read them all out. Most interesting, I think, is the legal aid portion. There's a lot of use of lawyers, of suing school districts, so definitely very nuanced, very complicated process for a lot of these families. I think one of the hardest parts to listen to parents talk about was that almost every parent mentioned how it affected their children's self-esteem and just how they felt about themselves in school. And I think that this process does have a lot of familial stress associated with it. So it's definitely a hard conversation to have with parents, but people were so excited to talk about it. I can't stress that enough. So looking forward, my ultimate goal is to submit my paper for publication in a peer-reviewed journal. I think this is such an important under-researched area. Qualitative research is so important, and I think it's really hard sometimes to explain to people outside the field of why qualitative research is important. Sure, it's hard to make great conclusions with just 36 or 40 interviews, but they tell you stuff you could never get from a survey, and that informs what could potentially be a great way to step off for quantitative data and actual concrete methods. I think also that this is a good example of how privilege can inspire and narrate research. Anytime you invoke on a research project, I think the goal should be to add something new to your body of research, add something new to our society. I think this project is a great example of that. I ask people questions they've never been asked before. I think that's why I got such good feedback and I was able to be so successful with my recruitment strategies. I'm not done yet, so keep tuned, hopefully, for a future publication. I'm thankful for this experience. Dr. Mercurio is one of the most amazing people I've met at BU. All the people who had my personal consultations, who talked to me about my project, and then again, my interviewees, those 38 parents who spent an hour to 2 hours of their time to talk to a complete stranger about really personal topics. So thank you so much. Any questions? Sure.
So for the people who access these resources that didn't have the same social or cultural capital, what are some of the strategies they took to overcome those barriers?
So that is a hard population to reach. So basically the only people I interviewed were people who were really successful during this process. I contacted advocacy groups and people who were involved in the social justice almost movement. So it's really hard to capture people who didn't have a diagnosis about a project about not getting a diagnosis, because how do you know you're even struggling with learning disorder if you're not able to access? But one interesting part, I was able to interview 2 people who English was their second language, and they spoke really interesting ideas about how that was such a barrier in communicating to teachers, and how a lot of teachers, even though their children were native English speakers, assumed that their reading disabilities were due to their parents' lack of knowledge of English. And then Alana?
So how do you think different states affected different resources? Did certain parents in certain states have more resources, or was it easier to navigate?
Definitely. I think that the best thing was for parents in their school where it had been a successful advocacy issue for other parents. That set the framework. But even in Massachusetts, which I think we consider to be quite progressive, dyslexia is not even included in IEP plans. So we are not even saying the exact learning disability for a lot of these students, which can definitely impede what resources you have a right to. The biggest thing is that a lot of these things people actually have a written right or policy to, but if you don't know and you can't navigate the system, you never get the chance. So I think that when we move forward and we write this policy that we all believe in and support, if we don't have the money to fund it, then it's only accessible by the very few who have all these resources at their disposal. Yes, Jeremy.
Could you give us an idea of the demographic breakdown of the interviews you had? Because I'm interested in how this affected
Sure.
along racial and ethnic lines and access to healthcare and also legal aid.
Absolutely. So the interviews were, for the most part, phone interviews. So it's kind of hard. I didn't ask a question about race or ethnicity, but I would say by far mostly Caucasian respondents. I also think mostly very upper middle class. People were talking about spending up to $5,000 to $6,000 for just testing alone. So I think that gives you kind of an idea. I think one thing too is like moving school districts. So for some families who couldn't afford to like move to a better school district or even stay in a high priority school district, that could be detrimental to their education as well. Okay, any other questions? All right, thank you so much.